All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here and for being part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. We're kind of we're going to turn a corner a little bit this morning in some of the theme, but just reminder. So Genesis 1 through 11, we're working through this slowly, and essentially what you get in Genesis 1 through 11 are these stories about what humanity kind of shares, right? So it's the closest you get in Scripture to something like a treatise on human nature, but of course it's not an abstract treatise. It's a series of stories that depict kind of foundational features of human existence, human life, right? And so we've been going through these, looking at them kind of one by one, and today we're in Genesis chapter 9. And so we're going to talk about the foundations of shared culture and civil society. So with Genesis 9, there's a shift from kind of a focus on individuals and the way we're put together as single human beings to families. Okay, and families in particular that are viewed as the origins of nations, right? So, and just to what I've been working with here, kind of it's a hypothesis, but it seems to map fairly well, is that when you have a set of stories about humanity in general, that the earlier ones, the ones that are depicted as coming at the very beginning, are as it were the deeper parts of human nature. And so we start with this picture of humanity as having a particular kind of agency that makes us the image of God, right? Dominion. And it's something like the essence of personhood. And then that gets differentiated out in Genesis 2 in terms of impulses to produce and protect and to communicate. And it builds up from there, right? And so the idea being that kind of the earlier things are the deepest, and the later things in this account are the more surface, the more optional, right? And yet they're all there at some level in all of us, okay? Like I said, in Genesis chapter 9, there's this shift from working with individuals to families on the way to nations. And just to point out, up to this point, God has only spoken to Noah, okay? But in 9:1 and 9:8, you get this shift. It says God blesses Noah and his sons together with him, and said, "Be fruitful, multiply," so forth. In verse 8, then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, right? So God now begins to speak to a family, okay? And it's a family from which God intends to make nations. Now, so humanity is God's image, and we have recognizable features and structures at the individual level. But it's also universally true. It's true of all of us. Humans are sticky. Let's put it that way. Okay, we come in clumps. We enter the world within a set of relations that exist before we get here. Okay, and so there's relations that we don't choose, that we kind of enter the world into. And with that, there's even kind of ethical obligations and so forth that come with those relations that are there prior to our choice. So that's a little bit difficult for moderns to kind of swallow, that there could be ethical obligations that are before choice, you know. But there's something there within us, at least at this level, whether or not we like it. We have this intuition that at least others have obligations to us, whether or not they choose them. You know, if you, for instance, if you never knew your dad because he disappeared, right, before you were born. Maybe he didn't even know you existed, But almost people in that setting often feel like there was something wrong with dad, right? So even if there's not a possibility of choosing, there's a sense of obligation at some level, right? So anyhow, this kind of clumping of humanity, it's a source both of joy and of frustration and pain in human life, okay? In every single human life. So that's a kind of element that we're going to see addressed now, discussed, depicted in Genesis 9. So let me give a really kind of high-level overview of the segments of this chapter of Genesis 9, and then we'll go back and we'll look at them a little closer. Basically, it breaks into two halves. So the first half in Genesis 9, 1 through 17, you get what must be understood in order to have a shared kind of family and then kind of cultural, social life, okay? What are the conceptual foundations? And with this then comes the basis for law, right? And as being rooted in an understanding of the distinctiveness of human life, okay? So we'll come back to that, we'll go down deeper, but it's kind of like the basis for law that allows a shared life, shared culture. It's rooted in understandings of the distinctiveness of humans, and then a certain understanding of how we collaborate with God as a society, as a culture. Okay, so that'll be the first half. The second half, verses 18 through 27, is basically addressing what kind of disposition, what kind of attitude, specifically towards the past, towards those who kind of taught us life, is needed in order to sustain some kind of a culture that can flourish. Okay. And so how do we relate to those that gave life to us, and that teach us how to live? That's what the second half of this is. So what do we have to understand, and what's the kind of fundamental disposition or attitude that we have towards those that precede us? And these together are both important for how we think about kind of that feature of humanity that we live out together in shared culture, shared society. Okay, so focusing on the first half of the chapter to start with, God, he twice speaks to Noah and his sons. The first is in order to give this kind of deep but very, very minimalist basis for any legal code. Okay, and then there's a second moment when God speaks to Noah and his sons, and it has to do with collaboration, covenant. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's start here with the basis of any kind of a legal structure for life, legal code, in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, and essentially, it's going to be rooted in an understanding, some kind of awareness about what's special about life, okay, about soul, right, and then about human life in particular. So let's read it, and then we'll kind of point out some things that are distinctive about this. So it says, God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the terror of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they're given. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you, as I gave the green plant. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, or literally its soul, that is its blood. Okay, and surely I will require the soul of your blood, or your lifeblood. From every beast I'll require it, from every man's brother I'll require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And as for you, be fruitful, multiply, populate the earth, or swarm on it, and multiply in it. Okay. So it said that there's this kind of awareness here that emerges of what's distinctive about life, about soul, right? And it's something that is shared between us and the other animals, okay, to start with. Now, there's going to be important distinction as well, but it begins with this sense that there's something kind of precious about life itself, about soul that enables things to live and breathe and eat and move and reproduce and all of that. And that becomes then, that combined with then kind of what's special about humanity built on that, being in the image of God, that becomes the basis of the single but kind of foundational instruction that's given to humanity at this point, which is don't kill, okay? Don't kill other human beings, right? Now, let me just point out for a second that this, as a kind of the preciousness of life, and then the kind of specific and utter sanctity of human life, such that if somebody violates it, whether man or beast, that person or beast needs to make recompense through giving life, right? That's a different kind of point of origin for law than you have thought of in other cultures, okay? So, for instance, Greece, okay? So the word nomos, what does that come from? Nemo, that's right. Yeah, which means to pasture, or then to kind of apportion, divide up land, right? And so what's built into it is this idea of there being places within which there would be a local, this is how it's done here, right? And so you have this sense of local custom that's the basis on which everything else is built out. Now, behind that, there's deeper things in terms of taboo and so forth. But law, it's kind of, you have this sense of, well, it's how things are done here, right? With Stoics and Epicureans, you get very specific accounts of, for the Stoics, it's a shared rationality. And when that's recognized in others, then, there's rational duties that come from that, right? But in the Bible here, in this Old Testament picture in Genesis 9, it's rooted in kind of what things are, right, in themselves. It doesn't have to do with locality in any way, right? It has to do with what animals are and what human beings are, okay? And so you get this, maybe most fundamental distinction in terms of how we relate to things here, which is the distinction between what we eat and we don't eat, right? So if you kind of think about how we understand ourselves as distinct beings, we can see that in part through the fact that there's things that we'll eat and there's things we won't eat, right? And so here, up to this point, we have kind of the depiction being that what we were given to eat was vegetable, right? And not just every vegetable, but like the fruits with seeds in them, right? And the grasses were for the other animals, right? You go back to Genesis 1, right? And now there's this kind of shift, and it's an acknowledgement, I think, that was made just before, that when they come out of the ark, this kind of volatile something in humanity that had led to the bloodshed prior to the flood, that's not been expunged. There's still something in humanity. There's still a hostile impulse that's a part of what is in the human heart. Okay? And this is, as it were, God's concession to that. It's like, okay, if there's an aggressive something in there and it has to go somewhere, you can eat the other moving things, okay? But with some very distinct restrictions, okay? And the basic restriction is this: that you don't eat the life itself. You don't drink the blood. You don't take the soul, which is understood to be in the blood, circulating in the blood, right? And you don't try to just, absorb that. Right? And that means you don't eat things while they're still alive, right? And, there's no, as it were, you could think of this, the cruelty of, you cut off a part of the animal and you keep the rest of it for later, right? Which, if you're thinking of it as nothing but, if you think of it as nothing but, a piece of meat, then why not? Right? But there's something in us that recognizes, like, no, there's something inappropriate about that. The life that's in this creature has a certain preciousness to it and should not be abused in that way, right? So you don't eat them while they're alive. You don't try to absorb that through just drinking the blood. You're trying to get whatever powers come from that, right? Now, it's interesting here at one level, because what this means is it's acknowledging a certain continuity between us and the animals. The shared thing is this soul, it's life. It's the fact that we're not just clumps of matter. There's something that interacts with the world in a way that's distinct, that we call life, right? And yet it also distinguishes us. And he goes on to talk about what's, to name that in terms of what was already said back in Genesis chapter 1, of being in the image of God, right? But at some level, this distinction that we make vis-a-vis the animals already speaks of what's similar and what's different among us, vis-a-vis the animals. Think about it this way. What other animal makes kind of rules for itself over how to treat other species? As far as I know, my cat doesn't seem to do that. And the cat doesn't care, if the thing's alive or dead. If it gets a piece off, it'll eat it. There's no sense of kind of, preciousness of the life. It's just another plaything, right? But there's something in the human intuition that we sense that's not appropriate, right? And so there's a similarity. Our bodies are, as it were, made of similar stuff, animated in a similar way, have the same kind of fragilities that the animals around us have. And yet there's this other something that is described here as being the image of God, right? And now this is referring back, so you have to remember, back in Genesis 1, the image of God is described as a kind of, it's a distinctive form of action, right? It's an agency, right? We're able to have a say over things and make choices, not just move, but choose, right? And so we're like the animals in that our bodies kind of function off of the same sort of things and have the same vulnerabilities, but there's this kind of higher possibility of agency, right? That's there within us, and it's, as it were, built onto that that lower feature of, as it were, mere life, of soul, right? And because of that, we respect soul, we respect life, blood, but then, and we have a kind of an immensely higher regard for humanity. Okay, so while there's a preciousness to life itself, so we're not going to drink the blood and so forth, with humanity, there's this requirement that if human blood is shed, there has to be a recompense. Okay, that has to be set right, and it's, as it were, for the world, not just at a kind of at a lower level. And this then becomes, in verse 6, whoever sheds Adam's blood, by Adam his blood shall be shed, right? That's the basis for any kind of legal code to come, okay? It's like, it's the touch point, it's the bottom. You hit the bottom and you come up from there, right? Is this protection and a requirement for an answer to any loss of human life. Human life is that special, that distinct, that sacred. Now, and if you think about what makes for kind of for civilization, for shared cultures, part of what goes into that is you move in the direction of, there's, as it were, elders at the gate, right? There's those to whom we appeal to sort out disputes and that have the say when somebody has been wronged sufficiently that there has to be recompense, right? So this is the beginnings of that. And we'll just point out that part of what is really distinctive of kind of biblical law with regard to the ancient Near East is that in the other law codes, you can make recompense for killing, for murder, with a certain amount of money. You could have a monetary penalty to pay for murder, okay? And that's something that's specifically forbidden in biblical law. It's not thought of back here as a possibility, but it's kind of precluded. It's like, no, it has to be, if you murder, this is the recompense, right? And there's a reason for this. If you just kind of think about it a little bit, you'll get the sense that if you can recompense for murder with money, that says two things. One, the value of a human life can be added up, right? It's a finite sum. There's a certain amount it's worth, and if you can pay that, then go for it, right? And that's kind of the second point, is that if you have somebody with enough means, there's no such thing as murder. There's just, expensive investments in people not being there, something like that, right? And so this kind of biblical sense of like, no, human life is not fungible. It can't be exchanged, added up, and then you make that exchange. There's something about each human life, because it's called into this kind of role of acting together with God. We're given this capacity as God's image. There's something about every human life that there is no amount of money that could add up to its value. Okay? There's no way to put a kind of a monetary amount. Now, just point out, that's something that not only in the past was kind of dispensed with, it's something that, again, in our societies is dispensed with. Because, part of what you figure out, for instance, with insurance policies and things like that, is what's the dollar amount or euro amount of a human life, right? And that's part of the reasoning process. Fortunately, it's not at a stage where it turns into, kind of a factor in murder trials where it's like, well, okay, so now you pay it off. So that's still out, okay? But there's this move, right? That is something that we, I think should pay attention to. Okay, so the first thing is this, something kind of distinct, very special, unrepeatable about human life. And you see this in the demand that if blood is shed, if if somebody becomes a murderer of a human being, then there has to be recompense. And then verse 8 and following, make this bit a little shorter. It's interesting, like Noah and his sons don't respond, right? I don't know if they're just kind of, flabbergasted, like what, So there's no response. So God continues in speaking in verse 8, and I'll just read verses 8 through 17 here. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him again, saying, "Now behold, I myself establish my covenant with you and with your seed, your descendants after you, with every living creature that's with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, all that comes out of the ark, every beast of the earth. And I establish my covenant with you. All flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of a flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I'm making between me and you and every living creature that's with you for all generations to come. I set my bow in the cloud. It'll be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. And it'll come about that when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. I'll remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, I'll look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God, every living creature of all flesh that's on earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all flesh that's on the earth." Okay. So what's going on with this covenant? Okay. The covenant is a sign both of favor and it's kind of a call, an invitation to collaborate, to work together. The term behind this, brit, it's not the same as like a contract or something like that. It's actually very specifically a treaty or a kind of an alliance, and it's used for when a higher king, a more powerful king, establishes this alliance or this treaty with a lesser king. Okay. And it's interesting because what that means is it implies this kind of agency we were talking about in terms of being the image of God, right? It implies shared rule, but under this higher sovereign, this higher king, in loyalty to that one. And so part of what God's doing here is he's making explicit something that was implicit in this first instruction, this first command that's given to humanity, which is about if man sheds blood, by man his blood shall be shed. In other words, what he's doing here, the collaboration, the co-working, is specifically he's delegating to humans, he's outsourcing to human people, human cultures, the retribution for bloodshed. Okay? And that has to do with, in the picture here, of the earth not being polluted. Now, if you go back to just before the flood, chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, what leads up to it is the earth was corrupt in the sight of God. The earth was filled with bloodshed or violence. It's the term Hamas. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted its way on the earth, right? And so the flood comes. What happens here is he's saying, okay, I won't, his agreement is, I won't do the hard reboot, right? I won't come in and clean up, but humanity has to take care of this in a case-by-case way. Okay? Humanity can't just let bloodshed kind of become the norm. That's what had happened prior to the flood. That was, kind of the state of the corruption, one of the things that led to it. He said, so he says, humanity, it's going to be the task of humanity now as families moving into nation groups, people groups, to stop the proliferation of bloodshed. Okay, it's so minimalist, right? But built into it is a lot, right? And then as a sign of that, kind of a reminder, is the bow is hung in the clouds, and kind of the idea there being, the bow, was it tokos, right? Yeah. If it's in use, it would be bent the other direction, right? As it were, if the bolts are coming down from the sky, it's going to be like this. If it's going to the side, it's going to be like this. But when you see it in the clouds, it's as it were how you hang it on the wall when it's not in use, right? It's end of hostilities, right? And so it's this picture of God, I'm not going to come after you, right? I'm not coming down to avenge everything. Okay, I'm hanging up that bit, but now humanity has a special task because of that, that is going to have to be carried out in these families that become nations and so forth. It becomes human responsibility to see to it that bloodshed doesn't proliferate. Okay, all right. So we now have, as it were, the basis in understandings for the beginnings of a shared culture with some kind of a legal code, right? And it's utterly minimalist, right? There's not much to it. It's going to have to build out from here, but it's a foundation, as it were. There's something special, something precious about life itself. It needs to be respected even in animals, though they can be eaten with, restrictions, right? Second, humans are distinct in such a way that there's no price that you can add up that they, to pay off the debt of killing one and so forth, right? And that distinctiveness, nonetheless, is, as it were, built on the same kind of life basis, soul basis, as you find in the other animals. And then this kind of collaborative work with God in ordering the world as being there. So that's, as it were, kind of a cluster of understandings, a conceptual basis upon which then some kind of a society can be built, is the idea. Okay? Now, so there's certain understandings that have to be there. Okay? And again, we could go back and we can argue whether, these are the best ones, and you can look at ones that are kind of advocated in other societies, and we can do some of that compare contrast if you guys want. But the second half of the chapter shifts, because it turns out that it's not just kind of, a conceptual architecture that allows a society to arise, but there's something that goes down to kind of like the deep dispositions and attitudes that we have towards those that come before us, that either make it possible or impossible for that society to develop. Okay, and this is so 18 and following. Really 20 and following is the most important part. We get this story about Noah and his 3 sons that I think is profound, and so it's a little bit bizarre, but let's read it, and then we'll talk through it and see what this has to say about dispositions towards those that give us life and teach us how to live. So verse 18, now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. And so these 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was scattered. Okay, people moved around on top of it now. So Noah became a man of the soil, literally, began farming, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself inside his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and went out and told his brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away, so they did not look at their father's nakedness. When Noah woke from his wine, he knew that his youngest son, what his youngest son had done to him. And so he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant, and may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And then Noah lived 350 years after the flood. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Okay. All right. So, kind of a bizarre story, right? You've got Noah, the great man, the one that we were told before the flood. He's the one righteous in his generation. He walks with God. He's, as it were, as good as it gets among humanity, right, at this stage. And he does something undignified, okay? It's not wicked, but, he gets drunk, lays around naked. It's not, as it were, worthy of the one that just, saved the world, right? So, seems a little base. Ham, his son, who we're told it's his youngest son, but for some reason he comes in the middle in the genealogy. It's Shem, Ham, Japheth. He's sandwiched in there. Maybe that signifies the order of genealogies isn't always the order of birth. Sometimes it's order of prominence, and it may indicate the youngest one trying to be he's a climber in some way, right? But anyhow, he's the youngest, we're told. He comes in, he finds his dad lying around naked, and he goes out and, kind of makes fun of it, right? Tells his brothers. Shem and Japheth, then they take a blanket, put it across their shoulders, and it's kind of this beautiful image of it because they're facing forward but walking backward in order to cover him, okay? I think there's some deep symbolism in this. So they cover the father's shame, as it were. And then Noah wakes up and there's the curse and the blessing, right? So what's going on with this? So start with Noah. Okay, he acts beneath his dignity. He does, right? There's no way around that. But it's important to point out that what he does is not, as it were, wicked, right? It's base. So it's not like he's got drunk and he sexually, beat and sexually abused somebody or something like that. He's lying around naked in his tent. He's just, as it were, kind of coming apart, right? He's breaking down, and so here's the thing, okay? At a certain level, no adult should be shocked to find out that even a great man is made of soil. Okay? That's the first thing. Right? And so, yep, it's base. But part of what God noticed right after the flood, you'll remember from last time at the end of chapter 8, was he said, "Oh, man's heart is still, wicked. The thought of man's heart is, evil from his youth," right? That there's not, as it were, a super high estimation of human nature, right? Of the human heart. So then we come to Ham. And let me suggest that what's going on here is that Ham, he depicts a certain approach to the past, okay? A disposition towards those that give us life and teach us how to live. And you can think about it as this, maybe in our day we would say his approach is debunking, okay? A kind of a cynicism, right? He has this way of looking back at, his dad, who's supposed to be this great guy, and he accomplished some things, and he searches out the flaws, right? And he's going to tear down the image that otherwise might be admirable. He's going to spotlight the cracks in his character. And well, here's the thing. There's always going to be material for that because we're all made of soil, right? Even when you get somebody who it has, a significantly developed character, a good man, a good woman, if you search enough, you're going to find something that's base. Again, I'm not talking about wicked, but base, okay? There's going to be something there. And it's easy, for, as it were, those downstream descendants, it's easy for us to go looking for what's wrong with those people that kind of established cultures that we enjoy the benefits of, right? And to do that while kind of living within an order that they put together, right? To go back and find out what's wrong with them. It happens in big ways and small ways. I mean, in families, you have these moments where, that teenager with 5,000 euros of metal in his mouth, looks at you and says, "You never loved me. You've never done anything for me," right? And he's like, there's this, it's like something doesn't fit together here, right? But it's easy, right, to have those moments. And like I said, if you look closely enough, you'll find something ignoble, something undignified in everybody, okay? But here's the thing. This disposition, this attitude, does not turn out well for the person who assumes it, or for those that kind of live in, who follow after them, okay? Because what it does is it unleashes a dynamic that it's not easy to, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, as it were. It's hard to draw it back in, to contain it. There's no natural end or limit to cynicism, to this kind of, searching for something to debunk, right? And because of that, it has this way of looping back on the life of the person that takes it on, that assumes that posture. And so in this case, Ham, by kind of focusing on what's wrong with his father, he sets a dynamic up that's going to affect his son and those that follow after, right? And that's the point here in 9:25. It's kind of paradoxical. So Ham goes in, sees his father, goes out and talks about it. And in 9:25, Noah wakes up and he said, "Cursed be not Ham, but Canaan," right? Ham's son. Why? Well, once you think about it this way, like just that there's actually a basic need in human life, right? That we have as it were an anthropological necessity. It's like it's structural to us that we, in order to live well within a way of life that we've received, at least partially received, we have to hold in very high regard the people that taught it to us, right? And it's not just like we ought to, it's like we need to. We need to. And this is why, at some level, you think of like the first fights that happen between little children, on the playground. What are they often built on? At least with, I don't know what happens in fights between girls, but with little boys, the first fights are always, things like, "My dad could beat up your dad," right? Well, it's like, what's behind that, right? It's that my dad is something that I hold with this kind of awe, right? And of course, this other kid holds his dad with awe. And that's exactly how it should be. But so then you get in these fights over, whose dad's better sort of thing, right? But what's behind that you see is this kind of this human need, right? That the one that gave life, the one that teaches me how to live, I hold him in a regard that just kind of borders on reverence and awe, right? This then gets kind of picked up later. It's interesting when God gives kind of the next set of instructions. So this in chapter 9 is the very first ones, right? But it comes back at Sinai, right? And the first one that's given that has any promise attached is you shall honor your father and mother. Why? That you may dwell long in the land that the Lord your God's giving you, right? And later in Ephesians 6, Paul kind of reflects on that, the fact that it's the first with a promise. But the idea here is just that there's this need, right? So what's the curse about? When we think about it, just try this out at least, okay? That the curse, it's not him just arbitrarily, making bad things happen to later generations or something like that. That actually what's built into the blessings and the curses here is he's voicing what's the intrinsic result, like the outcome of this disposition, of this thing that's being done, right? This character trait will naturally lead to this, right? And so what is the natural result of a posture to the past that's just looking for flaws and wanting to tear down and debunk? Well, the result is that this person will become dependent on others to direct them and to provide for them. Okay? So cursed be Canaan, so the son of Ham, right? A servant of servants he'll be to his brothers. Now, in the ancient world, first of all, you have, this isn't, as it were, like a race-based thing or anything like that. Slavery tends to be something that people sell themselves into when they can't provide for themselves. Okay, the person that on their own land can't structure their life adequately goes to somebody else and says, "Can I live in your house?" Right, and now he has to do what the guy's house, what he says, but it's a way of being provided for when one can't provide for oneself, right? And so what's being said here is something like this, that when we adopt this kind of posture towards the past of just tearing it down, it leads to an incapacity to order our own lives in such a way that we can stand on our own, we can make moral decisions, we can bear the weight of them, right? And we can kind of, endure, face consequences and carry on a life like that, right? Now, there's an alternative in terms of this kind of disposition to the past, and you see this in Shem and Japheth, so verse 23. They're the ones that they... think about it as this. It's something like it depicts a selective appropriation of what's good about the past and a forgiving of what's wrong. Something like that, a covering of what is base. And so in verse 23, Shem and Japheth, they take the blanket, the garment, lay it across their shoulders, and they walk backwards and cover the nakedness of their father, and their faces are turned away. It's interesting here at some level, if you think of this as a kind of an origin story for the beginning of shared life, of culture, right? What does it mean that you're kind of looking forward and walking backward? Okay? And walking backward to cover a specific something that needs to be left behind. Okay? It's as if when I turn and I focus on what's wrong, I now am going to carry that with me. Right? But there's this selective thing that happens when they say, okay, we don't need to focus on this. We're going to cover it so we can walk forward with kind of the honor of our Father to sustain us, right? So here's the thing. Let me just ask it this way. Are Shem and Japheth naive? Okay. And I think no. I don't think they're naive. They're fully aware of their father's flaws. They're just not obsessed with them, right? they know that he's done something undignified, but it's not something they want to dwell on and obsess with, and so they kind of shrug some forgiveness over it, and now they can walk forward, right? And as they walk forward, they have things that are worthwhile because he was, this is the guy who's blameless in his generation. He's a righteous man. There's plenty to take from his life as he walked with God that's worthwhile. But to do that, there has to be some selective appropriation because he's still human. Okay. Now here's the thing about honor in these interactions. When we honor something, in other words, you make it weighty, you acknowledge it and kind of speak it out loud or just show in other ways that this is something that's important, okay? It's not something you just blow away, right? Weightiness is the idea of honor in this kind of, in the language behind this in Hebrew. When we make something weighty, when we give it honor, we call more of that, we call forth more of it. That's how it happens in our relationships, right? When you see something that's of value and you say it out loud, you notice it, then that tends to be what the person produces more of, right? And so there's a dynamic here in kind of looking at what is worth honoring and doing so that has this upward lift, right? It draws more of the good, and that enables better things to happen within families, within cultures, within societies. Okay? And at this point then, verse 26, there's this, there's not just the kind of the negative consequence that's going to come on Ham or to Canaan because of Ham, but there's also then this positive consequence. This blessing. And again, let's try to think of this as it were, the intrinsic outworking of this disposition. But it's interesting how it's stated here in verse 26. He says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan, be his servant." Why is the blessing here? Why is Shem connected up with the Lord in this case? And I think the answer is that Shem's kind of selective appropriation and forgiveness it's embodying, it's living out a state, like a conscious choice that the Lord voiced at the end of the last chapter that we talked about last time. So in chapter 8, verse 21, the first thing after Noah and his family come out of the ark, he barbecues some roommates, and the Lord looks and he says, okay, the intent of the human heart, it's wicked from youth. Okay, like nothing, you can't do enough kind of expunging of blood in the soil to get rid of what's wrong at the human heart level. Okay, but the very next thing he says is, I'm going to stick with them. Okay, so what happens with the flood is that you have God's choice, that it's not an all or nothing thing for him in his, it's not going to be based on can human beings live up to a standard or I'm going to get rid of them. Instead, God, he knows what we're made of. He knows there's distinct limits to our goodness, right? And he says, I'm going to work with them as they are, and my purposes will be accomplished nonetheless, right? And so what's going on here is that Shem and Japheth, by this kind of forgiveness and selective appropriation of the past of their father, right? They're aligning with God's way of working with humanity despite flaws. So those who honor, they're aligning with God's way of doing things, as he stated in the story. And then the result is that there'll be they will develop families and cultures, they will produce ways of life that are capable of hosting, of receiving and kind of incorporating those who tore down their own place, right? So let Canaan be his servant, right? Let him be the one who takes Canaan in and gives them a place to live and a way to continue, right? So there's this, as it were, durability to a way of life that's rooted in selectively, forgiving the past and honoring it so as to move forward. Okay. I guess I'll stop at that point here. So what have we said? We've said you get conceptual basis. There's something intrinsically precious about life, soul. That's something we share with the critters, right? But then there's something absolutely sacred in human life that's kind of built on top of that. And because of that, human blood has to be answered for in a special way because we're created in the image of God. So that and that understanding that we're called to collaborate, to kind of play a role in seeing to it that blood shed doesn't accumulate in human society. God's entrusted that to us. That's the most basic covenant, as it were, here first. And then the second part is the disposition. And that it requires a certain subtlety and a selectiveness in how we honor and how we forgive, to be able to take from the life that we've been taught and bring it into the future. Okay, so future belongs to those who with God build it rather than those that tear it down. Tear down the past. So tearing down the past won't get you the future, right? Aligning with God to build, now you're on to something, okay? Now you're on to something. That's the idea. All right. Stop there, and questions, comments, reflections,